Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching The American Revolution Part 1 by Oversimplified. Now, given that we've already watched their videos on the French Revolution, I figured this was the perfect follow-up. Plus, you guys might know, I'm a big fan of the Age of Revolutions. The French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and in this case, the American Revolution. So I think these will be some exciting episodes. Now, if you would have liked to have seen this reaction early, or to get early access to my reaction to part 2, then you can become a YouTube channel member. You can do that by hitting the join button next to the subscribe button. That will give you early access to part 2 of this series, and access to a bunch of other exclusive reaction videos. Now with all that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
Holy smokes! Christopher Columbus, that is no way to address the king and queen of Spain. What is wrong with you? Okay, so you know how we're looking for a new trade route to India, right? Right. And the earth is round, right? Right. So I'm thinking we can just sail the other way around the planet, right? Yeah. So I set sail, right? And I reach India, right? Right. Wrong. Wrong. I did not reach India. I did not. Alright, no, alright, get to the point. Did you know there's a whole nother freaking continent out there? Okay, and do you think I should care about this? Why? Oh, I'm sorry. Did I forget to mention there's gold everywhere? Gold? Columbus landed in Central America in October 1492. And
Right, so Columbus arrives, and frankly, it doesn't take too long in the future for people to realize really what has been discovered here, right? Not just a couple of islands, but the Americas in their entirety. Right? This is a big deal for these Europeans. Columbus goes, he brings back tales of gold, most importantly, but, and what will sort of become more important over time, some of these new crops discovered in the Americas. Columbus comes back bragging about how pliable the populations there are, the indigenous people, meaning enslavable, right? So he's basically coming back with dollar signs in his eyes. And those dollar signs quickly spread to the rest of these European powers, and we see the beginning of the European conquest of the Americas.
he had the time of his life. And by that I mean he went on a huge theft and murder spree.
Right.
He stole gold, jewelry, people.
Yeah, Columbus, certainly an important guy in history, you can't deny that, but a bad guy, a really bad guy, even recognized by people around him. You can look at De las Casas, who writes a lot about a lot of the atrocities committed by Columbus and some of his fellow explorers. A lot of people were not necessarily fans of Columbus at that time for moral reasons, which shows you how bad a guy he really was, but important, sure.
And a hammock. And then he returned to show off all of his riches, including a few previously undiscovered items such as tobacco, the pineapple, turkeys, and a hammock. Now I know what you're thinking, but oversimplified, Columbus didn't discover America, the Vikings did. And you'd be partially right. In the 11th century, Leif Erikson was the first European to land in America. But hey, if you love Vikings so much, then why don't you check out today's sponsor? Vikings War of Clans is a mobile game that was
Nice
inspired by the
segue.
famous...
I'll let this play through. I usually do let the ads play through. I've got Oversimplified's video linked down below. You can go check that out, show him some support. And it's correct that Leif Erikson, the Vikings, were the first Europeans to reach the Americas. Of course, the Americas had been settled by non-Europeans for a long time before that. But in terms of Europeans, yeah, the Vikings, they did it first. However, their discovery of the Americas, you know, it's not nearly as monumental as Columbus and all of those guys. That really sets everything into motion, right? This spiraling chain of events that we'll see, well, play out, I guess, in this video.
and a protective shield. Don't forget to look me up and join my Vikings clan under my nickname, Oversimplified. Now, where was I? Oh yeah, Columbus, time of his life, hammock. And suddenly the race was on to explore and conquer the New World. After a couple centuries of warring with the natives and each other, the European powers had claimed quite a lot of land.
Right, though we're sort of jumping really far ahead. We're seeing here that Britain and France control a lot of territory, but of course, initially, Spain is the first one there. It's really them and the Portuguese who are competing initially. They are the two big powers, two big colonial powers among these European countries. Now, as time progresses, some of these other countries will catch up. The Dutch, in particular, are sort of among this next wave who begin to conquer a lot of territory, do a lot of trade, and then the British and the French arrive, and not only do they join these European powers, but eventually they will really become dominant, right? The British and the French will become dominant colonial powers, and that's what we're seeing here. Now, of course, Britain will be the dominant colonial power, and we're going to see them lay the smackdown on the French in this video.
Including this area, which both the English and the French claimed as theirs. One day the French said, I'm gonna build some forts along here. And the English were like, could you not? And the French said, sorry, but no, I could not. And they went ahead and built their forts, which pissed off the English. So they sent an up-and-coming British lieutenant colonel by the name of George Washington with a combined force of British troops and Native Americans. After a short battle, the French commander said, all right, we surrender. Okay, boys, pack it up. They're surrendering. Oh, sorry, was I not meant to split his head open with a tomahawk? Don't worry, it's not like this will start a 7-year-long major global conflict. And what happened next was a 7-year-long major global conflict.
Yes, so we have the beginning of the 7 Years' War, which really starts with Britain and France fighting over Ohio and western Pennsylvania, which sounds pretty crazy today, but that's the truth of it. One of the main forts in this conflict is Fort Pitt. That's what the Brits call it, at least out in Pittsburgh. I've visited Fort Pitt myself, right? That's one of the important sort of centers of this conflict, at least in the Americas, right? This is where the war begins, but the 7 Years' War quickly becomes this global conflict of pretty great importance. Really, I think if you're talking, I've said this before, if you're talking about this era of history, the age of revolutions, really sort of your beginning modern era, one of the good places to start would be the 7 Years' War. This conflict that gets all of these big European powers involved. It's so consequential for imperialism around the world. It also really makes a lot of them broke. This war, these countries sink a lot of money into it. Britain, which will be particularly important in this video, France, which was important in our French Revolution videos, but also all these other countries involved. What that means is they're going to have to work out how to pay off the loans that they took. Now, different ideas will be tried. Sort of a wave of reform sweeps across Europe, but this also leads to a bunch of these revolutions. So I think it's pretty difficult to overstate the importance of the 7 Years' War and all the events that will follow. It really leads to a lot of different things.
Which Great Britain won. At the peace negotiations, Spain gave up Florida, while France gave up all of its territories in North America.
Yeah, so France is really the big loser, right? Not only have they taken on a lot of loans, which Britain did as well, they're broke, but France has really lost a big, massive chunk of its imperial holdings. Now, at this point, they still hold on to their most important colony, Saint-Domingue, aka Haiti, which is making most of the money for them through sugar production, but as you saw there, in terms of just territory, France lost a lot in the 7 Years' War. And Britain, well, they were the big winner. However, that win doesn't come without some issues, right? There are some problems that Britain has to face after this conflict, even though they are the big winner.
But Britain's victory came at a cost.
Right.
A £60 million cost. They were now broke, in a lot of debt, and had to come up with some way to repay it. So they went to the colonies and said, okay, listen up. So a huge part of the war was spent protecting you from the French, and now we have no money because of it. So I'm not sure what you're saying here. Okay, so we spent a lot of money protecting you from the French, right? Right. And now we're broke. That certainly is a pickle. Listen to me. We spent all of our money protecting you, and now we need money. Can you please pay us back some money? No. Okay, we're just gonna go ahead and tax you.
Right, so there are a lot of reasons why this all spirals into revolution, and we'll talk about these reasons throughout this episode, I'm sure. But, you know, really a way to look at it is that the American colonies here, we'll talk about the mainland American colonies, the famed 13 colonies that will become the United States, our initial colonies, our initial states. They have been experiencing, up until this point, a policy called salutary neglect. Now, what that meant is, though Britain, of course, owned these colonies, and they had certain policies, they tended to not enforce them very closely. They primarily left these colonies to govern themselves, and that is really what had happened for a while. Now, there were a couple of moments throughout history when, Britain had tried to take a firmer control over these colonies. But mostly, and leading up to the 7 Years' War, these colonies had primarily been able to govern themselves, handle their own affairs, of course with due deference to Britain and the Parliament and such, but they were largely able to do what they wanted. With the 7 Years' War, well, what that means is Britain is sending a whole lot of troops over to North America. And so they take a more direct interest in these colonies. They begin to exert more direct control. They're governing far more closely. And that's a problem, right? These colonies have gotten used to self government. They've gotten used to doing what they want to do and flaunting a lot of these British policies. For example, in terms of smuggling, there's a lot of smuggling going on. A lot of colonial officials, they turn a blind eye to it. They let it happen. Well, that's all against the law. And now Britain's here, and they're saying, hey, we're going to exert our control and authority. So that's one of the reasons a lot of this is causing unrest. We'll talk about some of these other reasons, like the taxation, representation, things like that. But really, one of the big reasons is going from a very light style of government to a far more heavy-handed style of government, which no one really wants.
In
And that they weren't used to.
1764, Britain introduced the Sugar Act, forcing the colonists to import sugar and molasses exclusively from the British and to pay duties on them. Then a year later, they introduced the extremely controversial Stamp Act, and it worked a little something like this. Hello, shopkeep. Hello, Mr. Bungleberry. Here's the deed for your new shack. Stamp. That'll be 3 pence, please. Wait, what was that? It's the new tax. I get a stamp on any paper or documentation I make, and you have to pay for it. Would you like to see this pamphlet that explains everything? Yes, please. Okay. Stamp. 2 pence, please. This is awful. You know what? Just give me a deck of cards so I can go gamble my pain away. Okay.
Don't do it.
No. Don't do it. Stamp. Obviously, the colonists were like, hey, my dudes, this new tax legislation right here, this is BS. Until now, they had enjoyed relative freedom to rule themselves, and now suddenly Britain was asserting its control. They were especially unhappy because they didn't have any representatives in the parliament that was levying taxes on them. So they protested. Orators gave fiery speeches. British goods were boycotted, and anyone loyal to the British found themselves increasingly harassed.
Right, so sometimes people will point out that the taxes being levied on the Americans here were still far, far, far lower than the taxes levied on Brits back in mainland Britain. And that's true, but you gotta remember, it's not all about the money. First of all of this is relative, right? So you didn't have taxes before, you have taxes now, or more taxes, no one's gonna like that. But like I said, a lot of it is because they're used to this lax style of government, salutary neglect. Well, now that's changing. It's a more heavy-handed style. They don't like that they can't govern themselves. And then there's also the principle of no taxation without representation. Right? Remember, at this point, all these people still see themselves as good Englishmen. And so they believe in a very English tradition of liberty. Right? They see themselves as Englishmen with English rights. And they're saying, hey, wait a minute. You know, we should have representation if we're going to be taxed. This doesn't make any sense. Right? So that's one of the things that makes people very upset. So that's what I point out when people sort of mention that about the taxes. So yeah, it's not, I mean, of course it's about the money. It's always about the money, but it's about the principle as well. That's a big part of it here.
The whole thing actually began to take quite a toll on British business, and after just a couple years, the British were forced to repeal the Stamp Act. But we still desperately need money. What should we do? We could try taxing the colonies. Great idea. Wait, didn't we literally just try that and it failed miserably? Man, look at me. I look fabulous. Have you ever seen such a handsome boy? No siree, Georgie. No way. You're the handsomest, smartest, most popular king that ever lived, and everybody likes you. You're doing such a good job. Your Majesty? Oh, you're still here. Get the hell out. So in 1766,
Yeah, so we'll see this process repeated a few times, where Britain taxes the colonies in some way rise up. Now, it'll get more and more extreme. Initially, there are boycotts, people refuse to pay the taxes, tax collectors are harassed and attacked. What happens? Well, the parliament steps down, says, fine, we still maintain our right to tax you, but we'll take away these taxes. Then what happens? Well, they try to tax the colonies again, and the same cycle repeats. And first of all, what that means is these colonists are learning the lesson, hey, if we just stand up, they can't do this to us, right? We can stand up for ourselves, which is not the lesson the parliament wants them to learn. But also, what we're seeing is an increasing cycle of escalation, where the colonists are getting angrier and angrier, and they're getting more and more extreme with their resistance. And of course, Parliament is getting angrier that they can't enforce these taxes. And so they're going to resort to more and more force over time, as this cycle continually repeats.
the British made a declaration saying, we can do what we want because we're in charge and you can all go suck it. Then they levied a whole bunch of new taxes on the Americans via import duties. Glass? There's a tax for that. Lead? There's a tax for that. Paper? Tea? Oil? There's a tax for that. And once again, the Americans boycotted British goods, British business felt the pinch, and the British had to back down. Alright, this is ridiculous. They're my colonies, and I have to be able to assert my control. Repeal all the new taxes except for the one on tea. Also send 1,000 troops to Boston to take control. Oh, and make the colonists pay for them.
See, this is where it starts getting bad, right? Because remember, of course it's about the money, but as we've talked about, a lot of it is about the principle. These colonists, they do not want this direct style of government. They do not want taxation without representation. And so now you're sending in troops. That's exactly the opposite of what they want. That's going to inflame tensions even further. And now remember, I mean, we're not quite at the point of revolution yet, but the people, the colonists here, still see themselves as good Englishmen. In fact, that might be part of the problem, where they see themselves as, English citizens with English rights and liberties, whereas the crown just sees them as colonies, right? But these colonists here, and this is true for the revolutionaries when it all kicks off, they very much see themselves in the vein of someone like a John Locke. John Locke is one of the most influential thinkers on all of these American revolutionaries. They cite him constantly, right? His idea that the people essentially have a right to rise up against their government if they feel that government is tyrannical or not representing them. That is the right a lot of these American colonists are holding up here, right? And the right that they feel the British Parliament is not respecting.
And as British troops arrived, the tension in Boston was palpable. You could cut it with a knife, and it was all about to come to a head. On March 5th, a band of local patriots began heckling a British guard at the customs house. More and more Americans joined in the heckling, while more British troops turned up in support of their comrade. Snowballs were thrown at the British. The snowballs turned to rocks, the rocks to oyster shells.
Yep.
The soldiers, outnumbered, panicked. One thing leads to another, and you can see where this is going. 5 civilians were killed. The Patriot press throughout the colonies declared the Boston Massacre an unwarranted crime committed against the people of Boston by the cruel British, and the anger continued to grow.
Yeah, and this is a big moment in early Patriot propaganda. And now we're sort of seeing the forming of these sides, right? The Patriots, those who are revolutionaries, who will increasingly want independence, though we're a bit early for that, versus the Loyalists or Tories, those who are in favor of more British control, and eventually are just in favor of sticking with Britain. This is a big moment in Patriot propaganda. Very easily, as you can imagine, allows them to paint the British as these tyrannical, oppressive monsters who have come in to enforce these unfair taxes, and now they're shooting people. A big moment for propagandists like Paul Revere, for example. You might have heard of him, right? These types of guys, they really make a lot out of this moment. And they're spreading this propaganda, not just around Boston, but up and down these colonies. Because remember, when this all begins, these colonies, they have some links between them, but in many ways they don't have a ton holding them together. They are separate colonies. They run themselves independently. They've got different administrations. They have different interests in many ways. And some of them are more or less on board with this increasing unrest. And so over time, they're going to need to unify to become, the United States, right? And so events like this, and propagandists and newspapermen, like a Paul Revere or a Benjamin Franklin, who are writing up all these news stories and spreading them throughout the colonies, are really sort of making everyone feel like they're part of a shared struggle.
British revenue schooner that ran aground in Rhode Island was burned by the locals. When it came to light that the governor of Massachusetts supported the suppression of the colonists, his house was burned by the locals. And next, the colonists would set their sights on the remaining tax on tea. On December 16th, 1773, a band of patriots known as the Sons of Liberty disguised themselves as Native Americans, marched down to Boston Harbor, boarded a British merchant ship loaded with tea, and in front of thousands of spectators, threw nearly 10,000 pounds worth of tea overboard. The British were disgusted, and they punished Massachusetts with a vengeance. They dissolved its General Assembly, revoked their charter, and sent 3,000 more troops to occupy the city, meaning Boston and Massachusetts were now essentially under the direct rule of Great Britain.
Uh-oh.
And oh boy, were the people pissed. The other colonies saw what was happening and worried they might be next. So they called a brain trust to decide what to do. 56 delegates from 12 colonies gathered and met in Philadelphia at the First Continental Congress.
Right, and so when talking about building a unified movement across the colonies, this is a very big moment in that, our First Continental Congress, where we're getting delegates from these different colonies who are recognizing now that they are part of this shared struggle. And so, well, they should strategize together, And so they're coming together to work out what to do.
And the roll call read like a who's who of America's finest thinkers. I'm talking lawyers extraordinaire Johnny A. and Johnny J., experienced military commander George Washington, businessman and future alcoholic beverage Samuel Adams, fiery orator Patty H., guy who married a rich lady, Big J. Dickinson. And while they weren't present at the first Congress, soon names like James Madison, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and much later Alexander Hamilton would all serve time in the Continental Congress. The question now, though, was what to do about the British. After much bitter debate and disagreement, they eventually agreed on an amazing solution. They would simply ask the British to stop. Can you stop? No, it didn't work. Okay.
Well, you can see where they're at this point, right? They're thinking, well, this is all getting pretty out of hand, but we're not yet interested in breaking off from the British, so let's, hand out an olive branch. We'll reach over. We'll say, look, we want this to come to an end. We just want you to stop mistreating us, right? And the king is like, no, okay? A big part of this is that King George here was not the greatest monarch of all time, maybe not the guy you'd want in charge in this moment, right? Parliament, the king, and this is sort of increasingly through the auspices of the king, will refuse to step back. And so that sort of leaves these guys in a difficult spot because they're like, well, we want to resolve this amicably, but you're not budging at all. And so what do? Are we going to have to take that next step forward, that escalation?
Then tell the local militias to start arming and be ready at a minute's notice. And across the colonies, these Minutemen stood ready for the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. Now, having your colonies in open rebellion is one thing. Once they start arming themselves, that's when it really hits the fan.
Yeah.
So British General Thomas Gage ordered 700 troops from Boston out into the rebel-controlled Massachusetts countryside to destroy stores of arms and ammunition held by the rebels in Concord. The British set out in the middle of the night. Patriots including Paul Revere rode ahead to warn that the British were coming, giving the rebels time to prepare. The two sides met in Lexington as the sun began to rise. They faced off against each other, and in the confusion, somebody shot first. The shot heard around the world marked the beginning of the American War of Independence. The rebels were outnumbered and had to fall back to Concord as the British split up to search for rebel supplies. However, more and more Patriot rebels kept showing up, and this time it was the British who were outnumbered as more fighting kicked off in Concord. The most professional army in the world was forced to flee back to Boston at the hands of local, poorly trained militiamen. And all along the British route back to Boston, Patriot rebels continued to gather and open fire on the retreating British.
And this is something we should remember throughout this series, which is Britain, of course, has this very professional, pretty modern army at that point. It's got one of the best fighting forces in the world. And what we're talking about here are colonial militias, mostly untrained or little training. Some of them have served, most haven't. Gear, there's no standardized gear. They've all got different types of gear. A lot of them are just using old rifles they've had passed down from their dad or something, right? So there's an extreme mismatch here. And even when we get a sort of more official Continental Army, there's still an incredible mismatch between the British force, very professionalized, extremely modern for that era, standardized, far better equipped, and these colonial American forces, which are worse in all those respects, right? So they've got a big disadvantage.
When the British reached Boston, the rebel militias surrounded them. Boston and the British were now under siege as small land and naval skirmishes continued around the city. And the British would suffer another embarrassing blow, this time in upstate New York. Colonel Benedict Arnold concocted a plan to take the British stronghold Fort Ticonderoga, which held a large amount of guns and ammunition. He set off towards the fort alone, hoping to recruit men along the way, when he came across the Green Mountain Boys, led by Ethan Allen, who, as it turned out, had the exact same plan he did. So they decided to work together. But I'm in charge. No, 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 I'm in charge. This went on for some time, until the Green Mountain Boys threatened to go home, and Arnold had to concede. The group raided the fort at night while the Redcoats were asleep, and they caught them completely by surprise, taking the fort and all of its munitions with almost no resistance. Wow, great job, Ethan. Very impressive. By the way, what happened to that other guy we sent to take the fort? Who? Benedict Arnold. Never heard of him.
Uh-oh.
Ouch.
I'm sure this won't come back. Now, I'll point out, it's a little early for this, but keep in mind as the conflict goes on. This is quite the embarrassment for Britain, for the British government, right? Even these rebels winning a battle or gaining the upper hand or taking a fort isn't good. And Britain has enemies waiting to pounce. That's the thing, right? Now, the question is often asked, well, how do these rebels defeat Britain? It's got a far bigger, better trained army. It's far better supplied. There's a couple of reasons. There's a lot, but I'll cover, I guess, two right now. One is that, and you might have noticed, there's an Atlantic Ocean in between Britain and America, right? And so what that means is that it is harder for Britain to send in troops and supplies and all that sort of stuff, right? And so this makes it, even though they have so many more resources, it's more difficult for them to commit to it, right? And it's really a question of how willing is the British public, the British Parliament, the King, how willing are they to commit to this conflict? Yeah, if they committed absolutely everything, of course they could win. But are they willing to do that? That's one thing. The other thing is that Britain has enemies who are waiting for it to slip. Mainly at this point, Spain and France, right? They are not happy at Britain due to their prior conflicts, especially the 7 Years' War. France is particularly ready to jump in and try to, show the British what's up. And so once they see things are really starting to go bad for Britain, well, they're ready to jump in and fight. So that's a big part of this as well, is that it's not just Britain versus these American revolutionaries. Britain's got all these other powers jumping in, like Spain and France, and the Americans get some Dutch financing, right? So these other European powers are like, you know what? Yeah, let's dogpile, right? So there are more than that. These are some of the reasons why, in the end, Britain loses, and why it's more complicated for Britain than just the massive British army versus the American revolutionaries. There's a lot more nuance there that'll explain to you why things go the way they do.
What the Nobody knew what was going on. The colonies were in open rebellion, and for now, they even seemed to be winning. So King George fired General Gage, replaced him with General William Howe, and ordered the rebellion to be put down immediately. Okay.
And I will point out, I talk about the British Parliament as this institution, and of course, overall, the Parliament does want to put down this rebellion. However, as we know from history and today, the Parliament is almost never 100% united on anything. And so you have, a minority, but some members of Parliament who are legitimately sympathetic to the American cause. In the run-up to the Revolution, there are some members of Parliament, you could call them your more liberal or radical members, who say, you know what, these colonists, well, they've got good reason to be upset. We are not giving them representation. We're not giving them their appropriate rights or liberties. And even when the revolution begins, there are some members of Parliament who are definitely sympathetic with the American cause, right? They see where they're coming from, and they feel that they genuinely have been mistreated by the British government. So Parliament is not entirely united on this front.
Okay, the British are definitely going to retaliate for all of this, so we should probably put together a proper army. First, we need to pick a commander-in-chief, and I think we can all agree that that job should go to the man, the myth, the legend, George Washington. My friends, I am humbled and honored that you would consider me for such an important role. I did not expect for this. All right, you've been showing up in a military uniform every day for the last 10 months. We all know you wanted this, so cut the crap, George. Dude. Uncool. So,
I mean, this is a big part of George Washington's legacy, sort of understated and humble and all these sorts of things. And to a certain extent, that's true. However, George Washington knows what he's doing. He knows he's well positioned to be selected for this position. He's been showing up with that intent. So sometimes you need to separate the propaganda and the rhetoric from what is actually happening here. Right in this moment, George Washington, frankly, he is being ambitious. He is angling for this position. He's doing it in his typical understated manner, but people know what he's going for. Now, I will say there are points later in his career, particularly with the presidency, where I think very genuinely he was like, I am done with this. And everyone around him was like, no, you have to do it. So that's a bit of a different story. But sometimes his sort of reputation can overshadow a situation like this, where he's definitely being a bit ambitious, which there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. I'm just pointing it out.
Washington began his journey up to Boston to take command of the newly established Continental Army, just as the British made their first major attempt to break the siege. They made plans to take the high ground on Bunker Hill, but spies warned the Continentals of the British plans, so they fortified Bunker Hill and set up defensive positions on nearby Breed's Hill. The day of the battle came, and as the British advanced, a barrage of Continental gunfire was opened up on them. Twice they tried to climb the hill, twice they were pushed back. The battle lasted 3 hours until the Continentals finally ran out of ammunition and had to retreat, allowing the British to take the hill. While technically a British victory, they suffered nearly 1,000 casualties to the Continentals' 400.
This is what you could call a Pyrrhic victory. It also exemplifies what's really going on here, where, these Continentals, they can have better positioning, better tactics, but they're so badly outnumbered and out-equipped by the British, right? The Americans lose this battle, not due to tactics or anything, or, well, I guess you could say that, but they lose it because they run out of ammunition, right? It's simply a question of supply. They're not well enough supplied to win the battle, and the British win because they can keep throwing their men into the meat grinder, right? They have so many more soldiers, and they're so much better equipped that they can keep going when the revolutionaries are forced to take a step back, right? So it is a good look at the sort of character of this conflict.
Colonists showed the British that this wasn't just a rebellion, it was war,
Right.
and they were ready for it. But one thing they weren't sure about was why they were fighting. While some radicals were starting to throw around the I word, most hoped to eventually repair their relationship with Great Britain. So they sent a letter to King George saying, "Hey man, looks like things aren't going your way. Remove the taxes and let's be friends. I'm gonna kick your ass." Send that to the colonies. Your Majesty, your handwriting is terrible. Are you sure? Just do it. What does it say? He's gonna lick my...
Oh, no.
Gross. So for the remainder of the year, small...
I will say, you see, even at that point, even fighting has begun, though it's still relatively concentrated, though the casualties are going up, and a lot of these, what you could begin to call revolutionaries, still would rather have a peaceful resolution, still would rather not have independence. But, and this is the case with many of these revolutionary moments, the people in charge, in this case the king, Parliament, especially the king, is entirely obstinate. He says, nope, I'm not going to let it happen, right? So this is often how revolutions go. In fact, you can look at the English Civil War, which is often viewed as a revolutionary moment, I think pretty fairly, and you see that same kind of obstinance from a monarch, right, who's not interested in letting anything go. And what does that lead to? Well, nothing good for him.
engagements continued to occur around the colonies. The British burned down the towns of Falmouth, Massachusetts and Norfolk, Virginia as revenge for earlier anti-British incidents. These actions played right into the hands of patriot propaganda. Overseas, the British were seen as brutes, and the French and Spanish would soon begin sending supplies to the rebel cause. During this time, there was also minor fighting going on between patriot and loyalist militias in the southern colonies. Benedict Arnold was still on a mission to win some personal glory for himself, so he headed up an attempt to invade Canada in a two-pronged attack. The Continentals managed to capture some British forts and the city of Montreal, but a harsh snowstorm with some smallpox on the side saw them defeated and pushed back at Quebec City, and they were forced to retreat all the way to Fort Ticonderoga. Speaking of which, remember all those guns and ammunition? Well, this guy's got a plan for what to do with them. He uses oxen to drag 120,000 pounds of artillery for 2 months through the harsh winter, 300 miles all the way to Washington and his Continental Army surrounding Boston. Boom. Washington's got himself some big guns, which is fortunate because up until now his army had been suffering through the cold winter, not knowing when the siege would end. Now, they could make a move. Washington wanted to launch a full assault on the city, but his junior officers felt the British were too fortified, and to his credit, Washington was great at hearing and taking on board the ideas of others. Instead, the continent...
That is true. That's a particular quality of George Washington's that we'll see both in his time as general here and in his time as president. He always liked to surround himself with people of varying opinions, and he liked to genuinely listen to those opinions. Now, I will point out, George Washington was not as impartial as he liked to make himself out to be. Once again, you sometimes have to separate the reality from the rhetoric. George Washington absolutely had opinions. We'll see this especially during his presidency, and even if he didn't mean to, he would let those opinions show, particularly by favoring particular people or policies. So, he was not this entirely unbiased, impartial individual. Nobody is, though he liked to pretend to be. But, once again, he did genuinely like to hear from those around him. He would listen, he'd listen to a variety of opinions, and then he'd make his determination.
Continentals worked through the night, setting the guns up on Dorchester Heights, overlooking the city, and when dawn broke and the British saw the guns, they knew they were toast. Their positions were completely exposed. It was checkmate. They had no choice but to abandon the city. 120 ships carried 9,000 redcoats and 2,000 loyalists away to an unknown fate, and Washington had his first victory of the war. Washington then moved his army to New York, knowing that when the British returned, they would probably land there. In the meantime, a friendly-looking old man by the name of Thomas Paine had written and published a pamphlet called Common Sense, in which he advocated for total independence from Great Britain. It spread across the colonies like wildfire, and to this day remains the best-selling title in America. It was
You know, and this is a really monumental piece of literature, and it's interesting you see this appeal to common sense that you still see today in many democracies, where people will say, look, this idea, this policy, is just common sense. I don't know if that originates with Thomas Paine, I won't make that claim, but we see a big early example of it here, where Thomas Paine is saying, look, it just makes sense. Independence, right? It's just logical. Just think about it, right? And through this appeal, this really extremely popular appeal, I think he does make a lot of difference, right? So Thomas Paine, one of the big thinkers, philosophers of this moment.
was read aloud in taverns and meeting halls and brought the idea of independence into the mainstream. Congress began to seriously consider the idea. Thomas Jefferson was selected to write up an official Declaration of Independence, and he went hard, writing that all men are created equal, with certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Of course, Jefferson had over 100 slaves, but we don't have to talk about that. On the 2nd of July, Congress voted unanimously in favor of independence, and John Adams declared that the 2nd of July would go down as the most remembered day in American history. Then a couple days later, independence actually came into effect.
Yeah, and there's obviously the sort of hypocrisy here that could be talked about, right? The idea that if you look at a lot of this revolutionary rhetoric from a lot of these guys, they often talk about how, you know, we are being enslaved to the British government and we need our freedom and our liberty. At the same time, a lot of them either supported slavery or even owned slaves themselves. I won't say all of them. There is the rare founding father you can pick out that was, in one way or another, opposed to the institution of slavery, but a lot of them were in support. A lot of them owned slaves, including probably the biggest thinker, philosopher of the Revolution, Thomas Jefferson, right? I mean, he is really the penman of this revolution. His ideology is still so influential today and has been influential throughout American history. His ideas, in many ways, are at the root of American democracy, and he's someone who advocated for liberty and freedom and all these types of things. Inalienable rights, which all sound very nice, and they are. However, he's also someone who was this incredible hypocrite who owned people, a lot of people on his plantation. And so were a lot of these guys, once again, particularly your sort of southern plantation owners. Right? So that hypocrisy is really at the root of all of this.
The United States of America was born. There was no turning back now. The Americans tore down a statue of King George in New York and melted him down into 42,000 musket balls. To the British, it was treason. And if the king had his way, Washington and all of Congress would be hung. Speaking of the British, guess who's back? The king sent an intimidating force of 130 warships and 25,000 men to New York. Washington knew that taking on the most powerful military in the world wouldn't be easy. The British set up camp on Staten Island as the Americans dug into defensive positions around Brooklyn Heights, waiting for an attack to come. But the British just waited, wearing down their opponent's nerve while building their own strength.
Yeah, and obviously the Americans had a hard enough time fighting against British armies on land. Think about the British Navy, right? Now, the Americans will get aid from the Spanish and the French in particular on that front. But, you know, these revolutionaries, they do not have this great navy of their own, whereas Britain does. In fact, the greatest navy in the world. And so, you know, the revolutionaries are already outmatched in terms of the army. They are more than outmatched in terms of the navy. This is a big problem for them.
At one point, they launched a big scary artillery barrage and then said, you know, if I was you right now, I'd probably sue for peace. But Washington told them to shove it. The Americans kept holding out for what was coming, and when they finally hit, they hit hard. 15,000 British troops approached the American position, and the two sides fired on each other in massive rows. But what the Americans didn't realize was they were only fighting a decoy. The main British force was going around to flank the Americans from behind, and when they arrived, they inflicted heavy casualties. The Americans panicked and retreated back to Brooklyn Heights, where they then found themselves trapped between the British army and the river. It looked as though the war was already lost, but luckily, instead of attacking, the British decided to dig in for a siege, and then a thick fog set in, allowing Washington's army to escape across the river unimpeded. The British continued to chase and engage the Americans at Manhattan, and the Americans suffered defeat after defeat after defeat. It was a disaster. Washington's leadership was called into question, as thousands of American POWs were left to rot as traitors. Washington's army fled through New Jersey all the way down to Pennsylvania. Rarely had an army been so badly beaten, yet survived to fight another day.
Yeah. Oh, wow, part two. Okay, well, there you go. That was the sudden end to part one. I was going to say, Washington's leadership was called into question in that moment. That sounds shocking to us today, given, at least to us Americans, since he's such a revered figure, but at the time, a little less revered. In fact, a lot less. He had a lot of critics. But I will point out, sort of on George's side, that, Washington's leadership in this moment, I would say, was essential to keeping the army together. Now, this was not a good time. A lot of losses, a lot of retreating, but really, Washington's sort of force of character is, I think, what kept a lot of people together. He was quite the charismatic personality, pretty inspiring on the field of battle. I think it's generally recognized that he's not seen as this incredible general. He's probably not one of the best of all time, but I do think he's a pretty incredible leader. And like I said, quite an inspiration to his men. And I think that quality is really important in those low moments to keeping everyone committed to the cause. So I'll give Washington a lot of credit in a moment like that, when he was being attacked, really from, well, both militarily attacked and his reputation was being attacked. He was being politically attacked. He had to hold things together. And he did, though it was very difficult. So, that's the end of part one. Next time, we'll react to part two. Like I said, if you would like to see that reaction early and other exclusive reactions, you can become a channel member. And I'll have that part two linked down in the description and at the top of the comments down below. So become a channel member. Go see that early. Really appreciate that. With all that, you can also leave a like on this one, subscribe, all that great stuff. I hope you guys are all having a great day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.